Welcome, everybody. We're happy to have folks here today for a Virginia Archaeology and the National Register workshop, co-hosted, co-produced by CoVA and the Department of Historic Resources. I'm Jolene Smith, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the Director of Resource Information and Registers here at DHR. Eleanor Breen and I have been working on this. Eleanor is a past CoVA president, and you all probably also know Eleanor. Also with us in the room from DHR, Austin Walker. He's our National Register Coordinator. We probably have a lot of DHR folks online. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I unfortunately can't see all the attendees very clearly right now, but introduce yourselves in the chat and let folks know you're here. So I'm very happy that we've had such a good response. It didn't take long.
It's clear to see.
Right. All right. So Mike Roller from the Park Service has also graciously agreed to join us online today, and he's going to be giving us the bulk of our collective training. But I wanted to give us all some context specifically to Virginia and DHR and how things work here, whereas Mike is going to get down into the details for the National Register process and program. Cool. Too many computers. So for logistics, for the folks in the room, we obviously, you probably all figured this out, restrooms downstairs are closed. Use the elevators if you need them to go upstairs. Online folks, we will have a few minutes at the end before we break for lunch for question and answers. You can use the chat box to add some questions there, or wait, but also please wait till the end, and you can raise your hand and we'll call on folks for Q&A in the last portion of the event. So the morning portion of the presentation will be recorded. We will make this available on our YouTube channel, not the discussion portion. So just the presentations will be recorded. And those of us in person, we will have a lunch on our own between 12 and 1, reconvene back in here, and then we'll have some time for in-person discussion. Unfortunately, we're not able to turn on all of the mics to allow for the remote folks to participate in that discussion. It's just not going to work out to capture the audio. So in-person discussion after lunch is limited to folks here. Let's see. Okay. So back to context here. So DHR is Virginia's State Historic Preservation Office. Each state has one of these, as specified in the National Historic Preservation Act. There are some other abbreviations on screen, which are very small for the folks in the room, so I unfortunately will have to read them to you probably. For those who aren't familiar with the processes, SHPO is State Historic Preservation Office, NHPA is National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 is a portion of the National Historic Preservation Act. VCRIS is Virginia Cultural Resources Information System. That's our inventory of where we record our data. VLR is the Virginia Landmarks Register, and NRHP is the National Register of Historic Places. And if I use any other jargon or terms or abbreviations that you don't know, just raise your hand and I will define them, because it's going to happen. It's very hard to be working in this space and not fall into jargon. So also, you know, I've wrestled with how deep to get into the weeds of the org chart at DHR. But one of the things I have noticed is that a lot of folks on the outside work in very specific slices of our agency. So you may know a couple of us, but probably not all of our programs. And the National Register touches a lot at the agency. So Roger Kirchen moved into the role as Director and State Historic Preservation Officer. He has taken the reins from Julie Langan, whose name you may know. She was our director for a long time. And so our programs are nested in several divisions here. So here are our programs, and the ones with the stars are the things that the National Register touches. And you can probably interpret that even more broadly, but I was sort of stopping here. So I'm Jolene, I'm the Director of Resource Information and Register. So this includes our physical and digital archives, VCRIS, which is our inventory database that contains all the architectural property records as well as archaeological site information. GIS and the National Register program, where the technical parts of the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register sort of live. Additionally, all staff decisions about eligibility for whether properties or sites are listed on the register, those are recorded into VCRIS. So register touches lots of things, even just in my own division. Elizabeth Moore is also online today. She's our state archaeologist and director of the Division of State Archaeology. So this includes underwater and maritime archaeology, regional archaeologists on staff who you would work with if you were listing something archaeological on the National Register in most cases, our curator and our collection staff, and also conservation. So a regional archaeologist guide the technical parts. Amanda Terrell, who may be online, I'm not quite sure. She's the director of Community Services Division. And that's a really broad division with that's hard to name because we do a lot of stuff. But it includes cemetery staff, also the regional architectural historians. So as you'll see shortly, the vast majority of National Register listings are architectural, quote unquote. And so for the most part, our regional architectural historians are the entry point for nominations, even if they involve archaeology. The regional architectural historian is probably going to be involved. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging to figure out who to start with first. Just let one of us know and we'll help you get to the right place. In that division also are our community outreach program, historical highway markers. And so everybody works really closely together. We're definitely a collaborative division between them. Sam Henderson, who I think may be on the call, is the Director of Review and Compliance. These folks handle Section 106 and other compliance reviews and technical assistance. And RCD staff make desktop decisions often to concur or not with recommendations of National Register eligibility, or will take to an evaluation committee of many of us who will reach the phase 2 reports and together decide whether or not we agree that a site is eligible. And then our last division is preservation incentives. This probably is the one with the least intersection with archaeology, because archaeological sites don't necessarily qualify for tax credits. So a lot of the register program is actually driven by eligibility for historic rehabilitation tax credits. So I'll get to that in a little while too. That's one of the reasons why there's so much architecture and historic district National Register activity and less archaeological activity. Also easements. You absolutely can put an archaeological site under easement. So that definitely involves archaeology. And also for both of those programs, conditionally, places that receive that are eligible to receive tax credits or placed under easements must be either eligible or listed respectively. But we're using the framework of the National Register to make these decisions. So as you can tell, there's a lot of register. The tendrils of the register extend into many, many divisions here. Okay, so the register of the DHR. This graphic is a little hard to see, but I was sort of trying to represent how small the slice of archaeology is, but it's even smaller than this. So the blue bar at the bottom of this chart. So we have about 3,500 total listings. And let's see here. I had an exact number and it's in my notes here, but I think I found about 248 of those include criterion D at all. And those aren't just archaeological sites. They may specify archaeology. It's a little challenging to tease out which nominations are archaeology because it's not really broken out that way, although we're working on extending the data. Another fun fact is that Virginia is different from many states in that we have two registers. We have the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. The VLR was put into state code before the National Register came into existence. So there are a whole set of state laws and regulations about process and procedure for VLR, which is a little bit complicated and can get very particular when it comes to how we time public notices and board meetings. We have two boards that have to approve things in different ways. And some of that stuff is bound by federal regulations and some of that stuff is in state law. So for all intents and purposes, they usually mirror each other. Most things that are listed on the VLR are listed on the National Register, but occasionally there's a little bit of divergence. Just for a little bit of background there. So we may say VLR in different places, that's what we mean. So another important thing to know is that sites and also buildings and districts and above ground things get recorded in our inventory, which is VCRIS. So this is listings for the National Register. N equals 3,500. VCRIS is N equals 300,000. There's a lot. There are, for archaeology, that's about, I think we just broke 50,000 for archaeological sites. Sean might be on that call here. I should have this memorized since I calculate these stats like every week for my weekly report, but I don't retain this. Let's see. The rest, so 50,000 are archaeological sites, and then the rest are architecture. So there are buildings, there are historic districts, there are battlefields, there are all that stuff. All of that stuff is in VCRIS, whether or not it is eligible for the register, whether or not it is capital H historic. If we know about it, it gets reported. Let's see. So there's nothing inherently more special about the properties that are actually listed on the National Register versus the ones that we have evaluated to be eligible for listing. We just have not completed the process to list. So that's something to really keep in mind. So this is another area where I wasn't sure how deep into the weeds to get about evaluation and eligibility. But I feel like I need to discuss it just a little bit before we get into the listing this part of the discussion with Mike Roller, so we understand the differences and how we think about listing and eligibility and considering eligibility for the purposes of Section 106 versus listing something on the registers. So eligibility is a term we throw around a lot, most often when we're talking about 106 and compliance and CRM contexts. So for the most part, if you're doing CRM work, you're never going to actually list the site. It's just not going to happen. It's very rare. We make our decisions about whether a site is a capital H historic property based on whether or not it is eligible for listing. So this is part of the National Historic Preservation Act. It doesn't actually need to be listed to be considered historic. So in CRM and Section 106 context, this just sort of organically, procedurally has been sort of systematized, and it's fairly straightforward for better or for worse. The drive for predictable projects, timelines, and budgets have to some degree pushed us into a prescribed framework for evaluating sites. Sort of specifically under D, we're usually thinking about what it is, what time period it's from, what culture it's from, what its boundaries are, and with a historic context, which informs phase 1 archaeology to identify a site and phase 2 to evaluate it. And we've got a playbook to do that. The outcome of that is a phase 2 archaeological report. And everybody who's working in CRM is knows this drill, knows the format, knows what comes out of the other end. The idea is that once we get to the other end and we get the phase 2 report, that archaeological investigation gives decision makers enough information about the historic context, possible research questions, physical characteristics to decide if it's eligible. So hypothetically, we should be able to take a phase 2 report for an eligible site and write a viable nomination. That's very hypothetical. So in the real world, things often work sort of differently for listing archaeology. So actual listing, not just CRM reports. Archaeological nominations are relatively rare. This is going to seem sort of negative, but really, I don't want it to be negative. These are reasons. Since eligibility without listing triggers considerations under Section 106, and also considering that archaeological sites don't get tax credits, there are just fewer financial drivers, economic drivers, regulatory drivers, things like that to list. I'm not saying there are no benefits to listing. It's just not the same as on the architectural side of the fence. Officially, publicly recognizing a site's significance through listing can be really protective. We should list more, but preparing a document takes a lot of time and often money if the proponent is hiring a consultant, which they probably would more likely need to do versus the feasibility of, say, a homeowner writing an architectural nomination for their own property. The bar is just going to be higher for archaeology based on the level of specialized knowledge you need to have to argue for significance. So a lot of the sites that we want to list have unevenly available amounts of archaeological information available. So some of you in this room who I know are either working now on nominations or have in the past have experienced this. We may not have something as clean as a standard phase 2 archaeological investigation report to work with, something that was done specifically in support of this nomination. Compared to architectural properties, districts, and landscapes, which are observable with human eyes above the ground, making significance arguments for archaeology is just harder to do without conducting purposeful archaeological investigations, which costs. So what we need for evaluation or listing. So hypothetically, the framework is the same for all of this, right? We should be pretty much doing the same thought processes to understand whether or not a site is eligible versus if we're going to list this. Mike is going to go deeply into this, but basically we need to identify it, which is the RM we do through phase 1 survey. We need to establish its significance, and we need to establish its integrity. Like without a doubt, we need to understand that it has integrity. So in standard CRM archaeology, phase 1 and phase 2 investigations give us what we need to say this. If it's significant, we can say if it's significant, and if we can say if it has enough information potential in order to support eligibility. So when there's no dedicated archaeological investigation, and we're working with maybe legacy data or a mix of old surveys that were done for other purposes, that's going to be tricky to piece all these things together because we have to draw, the arguments that the initial researchers were making aren't necessarily the ones that we're making today. So it's a challenge to work with legacy information. But we do want to list more. As you can tell, archaeology is really, really underrepresented on the registers. The registers shouldn't necessarily be considered to be a representative sample of all of the history of Virginia, but we can aspire to that direction, and we can hope that we can connect to stories and cultures and types of properties that are not represented. Our goal here today is to sort of clarify paths to listing because it's a little bit squishier on the archaeological side. The other thing to know is sometimes we have to be pragmatic here and just know when our goal is to just get it listed. Sometimes we have a property, it's a mixed district or there's a building as well as some archaeological components. It's going to be a path of least resistance to not list it under criteria D for archaeology. Sometimes that is fine for if the proponent of the nomination has a goal of just expediently listing the property. There's room to discuss archaeological potential in the nomination if we don't have enough resources, time, expertise to list criteria D. However, if it's really valuable and a high priority for the proponent to get the actual archaeology listed as a historic significant element under any criteria, that's a valid decision. But there's two separate paths and two different philosophies about what's, how to accomplish listing. Is listing the end goal, or is having like a very comprehensive public history document of all kinds of significance the end goal? They're different tasks. And we also want to increase public awareness and recognize community value. All of this stuff, the registers are, consumable. They're even though archaeological information is protected, we post what we can. We redact and restrict a lot of archaeological register nominations, but it is still a public facing tool that we have to use. A lot of archaeological information in the state is just completely not available to members of the general public for good reason, but we're always trying to find ways to represent what we have safely so we can build stewardship ethics and community values and make this stuff useful to the communities that we serve. So there are a lot of really good reasons for listing more. That's all I've got today. It is 9:58. Yeah, I got there. Probably talked really fast. And if you have any more questions for me, hold it until the last 30 minutes after Mike Roller has a chance to go. And we will proceed from there. But write them down, note them, or just get in touch with me after this presentation. Thank you very much. And hopefully Mike Roller is online and can take over sharing.
Hi there. Can you hear me? How's my sound?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
I'm gonna stop
great.
sharing and you should be able to take over.
All right.
Actually, you might just.
Let's see.
There, perfect. He's coming.
How does this look?
Looks good.
Looks good. All right. I may turn off my camera to make sure my bandwidth doesn't overwhelm. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Jolene and Eleanor, for having me here this morning. It's great to be here. I'm the archaeological reviewer for the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks program. It's just me for both. So I cover the entire country. I'm a professional generalist by definition. And I draw a lot from my CRM background in everything I do, as well as my academic background. But, I was just thinking that I don't think I know any archaeologists that are not generalists, in the sense that we're all committed to sort of diachronic understanding of history and to the rigor and scienticity of our methods. And that really unites us. And so I really think about the kind of common interests of archaeological research in every period, in every instance, local, regional, and national, when I'm looking at National Register nominations. And they are really fascinating to see across the country and all the territories as well in the South Pacific. And I also work in traditional cultural properties sometimes as well, which is a very cutting edge aspect of the National Register, drawing upon ethnography and oral history, thinking about archaeology in a completely different way through indigenous perspectives and stuff. So I'll cover a little bit about that. So really happy to be here and excited to talk with you. I'm just going to start off with this very provocative quote to kind of start us thinking about archaeological significance. This is from the book Dawn of Everything by the late David Graeber and David Wengrow. It's a really fun book, and it covers a lot. it's more about asking questions than about answering questions. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. He has this quote about the Archaic period covering an immense span of time. One word for 7 millennia of indigenous history. And he says this very provocative thing. Archaeologists who first gave the period its name, which is really more of a chronological slap in the face, were basically declaring this is the period before anything particularly important was happening. Well, when I was reading this, I thought about the many lithic scatters I found on ridge noses and ridge saddles in the DMV area when I did CRM, and didn't really know what to do with in terms of significance and eligibility for the National Register. It's not that this quote helps us to decide those are eligible, but framing those kinds of sites in this kind of broad disciplinary problem, this question just about periodicity, nuanced periodicity, and regional ideas, is really kind of at the basis of what I think about in terms of significance, integrity, and research context. So whether you agree with this quote or not, I don't know, but I found it really stimulating for what I do in my job. Okay, so this presentation is kind of like hot takes. So there's the bulletin guidance, and of course, you know, the bulletins are very important. They provide a lot of detailed information, help you fill out the form and to think through some of the concepts. But what I want to do is to kind of restate some of these technical ideas in ways that I think are get to the point a little bit better and speak more to the things that archaeologists really think about as we're conducting our methods in our inquiry. So this is the straightforward bulletin. Criterion D is the quality of significance in districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. And sites can qualify under D only if it can be demonstrated that the information is of importance within appropriate contexts. And integrity is based on the property's potential to yield specific data sets that can address important research questions. Actually, the last two are kind of my take, but this is the way I like to think about things in terms of the sort of feedback relationship. And this is the process of thinking through from the very beginning of identifying a site, evaluating its character, and moving forward into defining significance. So here's my restatement of criterion D. A property's significance is defined by a property's archaeological integrity or the documented presence of particular data sets and their established or speculative potential to yield information or to fill gaps in the historical record based upon methods, theories, or debates in the scholarship of archaeology, anthropology, history, or related sciences, i.e. research contexts. So let's go back a little bit and look at the part of that phrase, have yielded and may be likely to yield. Have yielded has to do with the scholarship documenting the site's proven capacity to answer specific questions on a local, regional, or national scale. And I'm going to talk about these levels of significance. So an archaeological site that is eligible still must retain sufficient integrity to answer research questions, but I'm going to qualify that because they are, everything has to be in context of these three components. Maybe likely to yield can be understood as a kind of speculative research project. So we may not be planning to excavate a site, but we want to sort of speculate in terms of what kind of significance it may yield if we were to excavate it. Now we're thinking outside of budgets, we're thinking outside of capacity. It's best structured in the form of a significance context and research questions, which, if answered, may fill in important data gaps or provide an alternative theories that challenge existing ones. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go through this kind of scenario. And again, this is very simplistic and hyperbolic, but I think it kind of hits home in terms of thinking about that sort of feedback relationship between the three. So imagine the scenario where we find 5 perfectly intact late 19th century privies, you know, fill soil on top, totally intact stratigraphy below, and one well-documented pre-Clovis site. They're identified inside an APE and they have to be evaluated for eligibility. Now, two of the privies are very distinctly isolated, completely separately isolated, so they're not related, and they have no context. The ground surface has been scraped clean. All the built environment and landscape features were removed in the 20th century. And the documentary record is likewise absent of context. So I wouldn't say that the privies are not eligible, but they really can't be evaluated without this context. The remaining three are associated with a community of laboring free blacks who worked in a lumber industry company town. So we have a context for these three. And then the pre-Clovis site was 90% excavated in the 1950s. So it's mostly gone. So going back to the three privies, company records identify the families associated with the privies. And as we go through the scholarly literature, we learn that significance can be considered on a growing body of literature on multi-ethnic company towns of industrial scale, extractive industry. And they deal with things like consumption and resilience using data sets like dumps and privies. So the privies may not be individually eligible, much like the other two privies, but in combination with the broader company town landscape. And there may be an offsite district with standing structures, industrial ruins, and work areas. They likely contribute to a historic district, pending a kind of holistic evaluation of that resource. So now the pre-Clovis site is almost completely scraped clean, but it has a well-established scholarly literature, and we also have collections. And we do know there's micro or macrobotanical materials and other paleoenvironmental information that would augment our understanding of the site with climatic conditions when the site was occupied down to the seasonal level. This is actually taken from a particular case I've been dealing with for the National Historic Landmarks Program. Like a stunning site, but everything has been removed except for paleoenvironmental information. We have the has yielded and now the potential to yield. This information would boost the value of the collection of faunal remains and lithic material tremendously by understanding things at this level using current technology. The data set would challenge or elaborate upon fundamental theories about the peopling of the Americas. It is individually eligible and should be evaluated for national significance following a comparative analysis of similar sites across the region or countrywide. So I think, you know, this scenario, thinking about this site in very poor condition, honestly, 90% excavated, but the significance of what remains is tremendous, and the context we bring to bear on it really demonstrates the significance of that. Whereas the privies, you know, very exciting to find a privy perfectly intact, but we need to be thinking about context at a local, regional, or national scale. Okay. That's my time. Okay. So this is just sort of a footnote to that, thinking about archaeology in the heavily excavated site, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and other places may still retain research potential if they're thoughtfully managed so as to retain continued ability to yield information. Okay, now let's start to unpack some of those terms we've been throwing around. This is a sort of listing from a well-known book, Assessing Archaeological Significance by Donald Hardesty and Barbara Little. Barbara Little, of course, worked for the National Park Service, retired last year. She was in the National Register for many years, a powerhouse to Barbara Little. And this book does a really good job of kind of thinking about significance and using, I'd say, sort of novel language to think about it. So they present this listing, and I really love classification systems as an archaeologist, 5 different ways to think about contexts for significance. Preservation and site interpretation. You know, I think these sort of capture the ways, the sort of roles that archaeology can play in understanding history in different ways, in different social roles. So for reconstructions or public interpretation or management, historical supplementation is a sort of classical role for archaeology to add to understandings of the past that only archaeology can reveal. historical ethnography, documenting the lives of those poorly documented, provide data to answer broad anthropological questions about settlement, lifeways, movement, ideology, identification, and worldview. Testing ground for archaeological principles. So there may be those sites that are firsts for the usage of certain methods or for defining a regional chronology. Certainly those on the National Register are designated as National Historic Landmarks, adding to a grounding of explanatory principles in history, anthropology, and archaeology. And then understanding of modernization and globalization. I think that's a little redundant to some of the previous ones, but broad understanding of local instantiations of national or global phenomena such as colonialism, modernization, industrialization, and capitalism. And these are the sort of broad anthropological kinds of questions we might be asking across a national data set, right? Thinking about creolization or acculturation or whatever maybe the appropriate or hot disciplinary term of the moment. And I think, these help us think about how this effort in the National Register of Historic Places is really tied in or linked to what happens in conferences. It's really important, I think, for all of us to be engaged in those conversations because those ideas that are being discussed, day by day, month by month in conferences and journals are really at the heart of these ideas about listing. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through these a little bit quickly, but these are kind of examples of what I mean, or what Little and Hardesty mean by some of these contexts. Historical supplementation. In this case, these are examples from listed properties. Understanding the evolution of logging technology at redacted site will provide insight into the specific methods used to cut and transport the enormous redwood logs in this particular logging district. And then here's some research questions that kind of help us punctuate understanding of that significance. What were the general logging techniques employed by the ERM&L company? Did the techniques change over time during the period 1884 to 1937? How did employees cope with these technological changes? Okay, testing ground for archaeological or other scientific principles. This was a really interesting one by a federal agency. Archaeological objectives, I'm going to jump into that orange square. These sites represent artificial reefs from well-documented dates of a similar time period, offering biologists a unique opportunity to study the artificial reef effect of man-made structures in deep water. Archaeological objectives include determining each vessel's past and present condition, state of preservation, and assess any environmental impact caused by the wreck, and make observations relating to its deterioration and future research potential. Determine the biological effects of shipwreck artificial reefs at selected sites. And then I'll go over this one quickly. Also, I thought a really novel way of thinking about site Aeolian processes for site creation or site formation. And this federal agency nomination looked at how not only how prehistoric inhabitants of the region use the landscape, as well as the site formation processes affecting archaeological preservation. So, and this fed into interpretation at the site as well as preservation. So some research questions: what are the rates of Aeolian processes like erosion and deposition in the district? Okay. So levels of significance. I think this is not only an important part of defining the significance or the scope of the significance or the contexts in a nomination through which we may be assessing or evaluating its significance. But it's also a kind of interesting way to think about significance. Local contexts represent an aspect of the history of a town, city, county, cultural area, or region, or any portions thereof. So very, very locally specific, and it might have to do with what may sound occasionally kind of redundant, like what would the study of an archaeological site tell us about that archaeological site? Now, that's not really not a particularly solid way of thinking about data potential, but we want to expand our understandings of what it may inform to think about local aspects or local contexts. Regional contexts, an aspect of the history of the state as a whole. So pre-contact resources that might be of state significance include regional sites that provide a diagnostic assemblage of artifacts for a particular cultural group or time period, or that provide chronological control. And then national contexts are an aspect of the history of the United States and its territories as a whole. This is the language from our bulletin. Nationally significant properties do not necessarily have to belong to a property type found throughout the entire country. They can be located in only a portion of the present political boundaries. National significance helps us understand the history of the nation by illustrating the nationwide impact of events or persons associated with the property. I'm going to go through this a little quickly. This PowerPoint is one I use for different states, and I sometimes pick and choose. It's sort of modular according to what the state is interested in. So I'm going to move through this quickly, and I'll share the PowerPoint deck with Jolene afterwards. But here's an example of levels of significance through a particular example of a mining town. My actual research background is in the archaeology of industry and labor. So this property includes privies from company houses and shanty towns, domestic remains, architectural remains of shanties and outbuildings, of course, industrial sites, industrial landscapes, and working processes. A lot of text on this slide. So what I provide on the right side are example research questions that we might be considering from a local context. Site-specific reconstructions of space or demographics or internal variation, settlement patterns, household reconstruction, site-specific diachronic change. So you can see how this sort of fits into that research context we're discussing from Little and Hardesty about site preservation or site interpretation. Statewide significance, range and variation in cultural, economic, or technological change at a regional scale. Regional chronologies and material culture change across a region. So we may be bringing in an understanding of related comparable sites in the region, what's understood and how a particular site may contribute to changing or augmenting that regional understanding. And then national significance, national or global scholarship in archaeology. Again, going back to these broad debates on a conceptual or theoretical level. Issues like identification or power, technological diffusion, hybridization, resistance, resilience, that sort of stuff. Okay, so I said I also work for the National Historic Landmarks Program, and I just want to distinguish the two programs a little bit here, particularly in terms of national significance, which is a little confusing as to whether, every National Register listing at the national level is eligible for the National Historic Landmarks Program. And I like to think of it broadly, the difference broadly as this highlighted section at the top. The focus of national significance for the NHL program is on national impact rather than regional instantiation. And the documentation standards for the NHL are different, and I think they augment that argument for national impact. So there's actually 6 criteria rather than 4. And in the beige colored box, I have the actual language of criterion 6. I like the last sentence. Such sites are those which have yielded or which may be reasonably expected to yield data affecting theories, concepts, and ideas to a major degree. And then I would also note the part of the criterion that says, by revealing new cultures or by shedding light upon periods of occupation over large areas of the United States. So, this is, I think, recognizing that all of the research questions that we may apply in archaeology are founded upon a basic understanding of chronological and material control over regions. So that sort of hard work that the culture historians did to establish regional chronologies. And those continue to be extremely important as we fill in gaps. National Historic Landmark documentation includes extensive description and contextual documentation. The process for designating is different. It's designated by the secretary through a lengthy process of internal and external review. There's a board, an NHL committee of folks assembled from outside the Park Service, some subject matter experts. And then I think this speaks to that notion of national impact. It requires a pretty significant comparative analysis of properties on a national scale. Okay. Sorry, this is a lot, a lot of text. We're going to talk about integrity here, and this is again the bulletin language. Integrity relates directly to a site's capacity to answer research questions defined through a historic or scholarly context. And what are we talking about when we're talking about data sets or archaeological integrity? It really depends, and it really varies from site to site. So the nature of materials or features present based upon, of course, sampling, right? Archaeological sites are, unless they're fully excavated, are always a sample, and often a sample of a sample, or even a sample of a sample of a sample. And so our understanding of each site is multi-stranded. It comes from different sources. So, but it often lays out into things, you know, just a second. Spatial patterning of surface artifacts or features that represent differential uses or activities. These are sort of the goals of a phase 2, right? Spatial patterning of subsurface artifacts or features, or a lack of serious disturbance to a property's archaeological deposits. That last one is really important, I think. This is kind of that negative information. We know that a site was present and that there may be many feet of fill layered on top of it. Well, that's very important information for us to understand, the post-depositional processes. That can help us to kind of infer ideas about its archaeological integrity. Okay, so here's kind of restating what I mean by the multi-stranded evidence. Of course, it's assessed through the analysis and synthesis of multi-stranded evidence by a professional archaeologist. That's what we do from our very dirty way of understanding a sample of a sample of a sample. It's a heroic effort. Documentation of professionally conducted systematic field methods and analysis. Collections, site reports, and scholarly context are essential components of multifaceted evidence for significant archaeological integrity. And then, of course, non-intrusive technologies like aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and LiDAR are all increasingly extremely valuable, especially for sites like at the top right, the mound sites. It's astounding what exists in that very fine-grained aspect of landscape that is visible to LiDAR and other forms of non-intrusive technology. But also we may be using historical map overlays, oral history or ethnographic accounts. As I mentioned before, the documented post-depositional history. And then assessments based upon comparative analysis with similar sites. So we may know that there may be quarters of the enslaved that have good a positive, optimistic post-depositional history. We can infer based upon comparative analysis the kinds of features and artifacts that may be present. And from that, we can work towards developing that evaluation of significance. So data sets or data categories are groups of information defined by the archaeologist, taking into consideration the types of artifacts and features, research questions, and analytical approach that is to be used. It's the evaluation or analysis of data sets and their patterning within the framework of research questions that yields information. So they can be artifacts or features, Or it can be like that photograph that's from my dissertation about the movement of people from one portion of a town to another portion of a town, and the comparison of material culture across those two locations. Collections, of course, can't be listed, but they can augment significance as comparative or contextual information, like in the scenario I talked about above with the um, very early site. Okay. A site versus a district, of course. You know, I think when we're thinking about sites, we define them in a particular way in the National Register that doesn't always overlap with the sort of management category of a site that is developed in the process of managing a property. Broadly, the National Register defines a site as the location of a significant event or of historical human occupation or activity. So there are sites listed in the National Register that are not archaeological. They are the locations of a significant event, like a battle. And in this case, you know, there needs to be sometimes a translation where we may have multiple sites that are listed, and the listing of those sites or the defining of those sites by trinomials may be an artifact of this process of surveying across time. So when we're thinking about significance and defining a site for listing in the National Register, we may need to sort of translate that site with the small s to site with the large s to really think about significance holistically. If sites have a direct relationship through cultural affiliation, but they're disconnected, they may be considered a discontiguous district. So there may be multiple sites listed, two to three sites, I would say, to make up a discontiguous district that really depend upon each other to understand significance. But they may be separated by space that we can say oftentimes, you know, a right of way or a railroad was built that definitely destroyed the archaeological remains between the two. But putting the two together through listing really makes sense because we can really understand their significance. And then a district is a grouping of sites, buildings, or structures that are linked historically by function, theme, or physical development. And their significance should be holistically or collectively understood as contributing to an overall significance. So thinking back to those archaic period lithic scatters, you know, one by itself may not have sufficient context to understand, but when we have a broad landscape with a grouping of archaic activities, including lithic scatters and other sorts of sites, now we're starting to sort of heat up and thinking about this holistic significance across a district. And now we're starting to really push into those questions about regional periodicity and nuance within that 7 millennia. Okay. This is about organizing information. I also work pretty heavily on National Park Service nominations, which are a kind of special genre of National Register listing because there's a particular law in the National Park Service guidance that requires the listing of properties, actually for all federal properties, that include the full measure of regional context. So we have very complicated districts that overlap with the boundaries of National Park Service sites, with historic and pre-contact sites all overlapped. So this is an example of a table included in a National Park Service nomination, actually for Pecos. And you can see that there are different criterion, and oftentimes local, regional, or national. This is maybe not the best example for this, but multiple sites. And this table helps us to sort of sort out the levels, separate levels of significance and the separate criterion. And this is really important for management purposes when we're dealing with Section 106 to think about. Okay, landscapes as districts. This is something we're starting to see increasingly in National Register listings and National Historic Landmark listings. Coming from a very rich scholarship, an interdisciplinary scholarship, and thinking about archaeological landscapes or built environment landscapes or designed landscapes. Fundamentally, of course, landscapes are not a property type, so they're usually listed as districts or sites. But we found it's a useful holistic lens to evaluate groupings of cultural resources that combine subsurface and surface sites and things like transportation networks and natural resources, naturally and culturally altered topography and small features, and then objects that are not necessarily eligible for listing as contributing features, but are really important to the integrity of a landscape. So things like monuments or large-scale objects like engines or other industrial devices. And of course, ultimately, we still need to translate this into the language of the National Register through resource types and contributing resource counts. We have two great bulletins. There's one on listing rural landscapes, and then I believe our battlefield bulletin talks a bit about landscapes and understanding them. Archaeological resources may be related to an area's significance. They may provide additional or complementary information about an area. They may provide depth to the understanding of the full human use of a particular place through time. And they may help to define the landscape itself. For example, the archaeological traces of these transportation networks are really, really important to thinking about a landscape in terms of its function and its use and its activity areas, the way that the discrete areas of that landscape were integrated across time and space, of course. And the archaeology may support additional areas of significance and integrity. There are listings that represent archaeological landscapes where everything is subsurface. But when we think of the sum total of the contributing sites, we can put together this sort of holistic understanding of occupancy across a period of significance. Frequently, landscapes are used for battlefields, in these cases where the course of events across a battle may focus on a farmstead or a transportation network that was really pivotal at a particular moment. And its identification may be only archaeological, but it helps us to understand that movement across that space. Down to the minute documented in historical documentation. They traversed down this road and were confronted by a line of fire, et cetera, et cetera. And then traditional cultural properties also are often best understood through the lens of landscape because of those aspects of integrity, of feeling, and association, and setting that often are very important to define the significance of a landscape to a traditional group. This is just an example of a maritime cultural landscape from California. There's a multiple property for dog hole ports, which were these sort of ports that were built across the Pacific coast to quickly get out materials from extractive industries like logging or minerals. And they often were in these very rugged areas that depended upon natural topography. So these districts are really fascinating in the ways that they combine archaeology and natural resources. In orchards, here it talks about orchards and underwater resources. Sorry, that's really important. Also mixing underwater resources. And really, when you read the whole of the resource count, you really get a feel for the significance of the ports when we think about things in terms of the continuity and movement of historical usage across space, from the inland to the sea, to the water. All right. Nomination of archaeology sites under criteria other than D. So I talked about this a little bit before, and I think this pertains. I think the application of significance of archaeological sites to battlefields is really the best way to think about this, I think. Archaeological resources may contribute to the significance of a district or property by providing important landscape features. Resources must be demonstrated to be clearly present and associated with an event, person, and period of significance. Criterion A, significance of an event or pattern of events. So battles, of course, treaty signings, court decisions, forced migration, chapter or development in the history of American archaeology. So there are a few sites that were pivotal in providing information to the history of American archaeology or the usage of methods that are fully excavated, but they've been listed under criterion A alone for that significant event. And I think conceptually this works only at the national level of significance. It's a little bit tough to say every fully excavated site that provided a lot of information is significant under criterion A at the local level for providing that information. So it's an interesting thing to think through. Criterion B is the historical relevance or significance to historical or political figures, such as creator beings in the case of sites significant to tribes, to important political figures. I often think about the kind of intimacy of material culture present at an archaeological site associated with a political figure that really goes beyond what we might find in the documentary record. So, and then criterion C, archaeological sites contain combinations of architectural or engineered and subsurface remains. There are some really significant industrial remains where the chain operatoire, the industrial processes are really evident in the relationship between archaeological features connected to each other that establish this designed or built environment for this historical function. Some of it may be subsurface, all of it may be subsurface, but the archaeological sites really help us to understand that engineering significance of that site. Okay, here's an example of an archaeological site significant under A. So Saugus Ironworks, National Park Service site. I saw your question, Maureen. Maybe this may help answer your question, and then we could talk about it again. The Q&A. District possesses significance under criterion D. It has a pre-contact component. And then it's significant under A for its role in the development of industrial archaeology in the 60s and 70s. Roland Wells Robbins created a lot of very basic fundamental methods for documenting large American industrial sites. And it's really the work that he did at Saugus that established industrial archaeology as an important subdiscipline in archaeology. So that's significant under A for its role in the industrial development of industrial archaeology, but also B for its association with Roland Wells Robbins. And it goes down to being able to identify the specific locations that he excavated. He set the standard for industrial archaeology and its role in public interpretation and preservation. Okay. How am I doing with time? Okay, I think we're doing okay. Establishing defensible boundaries. There's really no single method for defining boundaries. And, we all know the different methods for establishing the horizontal definition for an archaeological site, which always involves some form of sampling, of course. Where do the positive shovel tests peter out, etc. It's most important that the documentation justifies the methodology and it uses it consistently. So, and of course, like significance, it requires a synthesis of multi-stranded evidence. So subsurface testing and surface observation and topographic or other natural features, which is often very valuable for pre-contact sites. Observation of post-depositional land alterations. So we may know distinctly that a site cannot exist in a particular area because of the way it was scraped clean or removed. Historical or ethnographic documents, distributional analysis, predictive modeling, and it's just a fact that access to adjacent properties or owner objection may prevent a portion of an archaeological site from being listed or included. It's not ideal, but that's just the reality we live in. So establishing a defensible boundary requires documenting that methodology and justifying it. There's a section in the nomination that asks for a boundary justification. And bringing to bear that evidence in that section is really important. Boundaries should encompass but not exceed the full extent of significant resources making up the property. So buffers are not really appropriate for the National Register. And no donut holes, no spaces cut out in the middle. But discontiguous boundaries are possible if justified. And then adding place saver language to a nomination and stating that further survey or other changes may mean that the boundary may change. So ADBC is additional documentation / boundary change that may expand the boundaries of a property or decrease the boundaries of a property if fortunately that such a thing happens. And we're seeing this more and more often. Here's an example, particularly, we talked about the application of non-intrusive survey methods these days has really changed the way we understand what's happening subsurface. It's really, really offering us a new sample for understanding sites. So a lot of mound sites in the Midwest were listed carefully constrained around the visible surface structures. But using other LiDAR and other non-intrusive methods, we can really understand that actually a lot still remains underground. And this is one of those cases. If we look at this example here, I think I give the example on the next page. So nominations are living documents, and they can be amended or revised or expanded through additional documentation, and that may change a property's historic name, update the condition of the property, clarify boundaries. It may expand significance for additional levels of significance or criteria, new areas of significance. Criterion D may be added. I see that often where previous or earlier nominations neglected to consider archaeology. And of course, increase boundaries or decrease boundaries or reclassify contributing and non-contributing resources. Of course, these large historic districts of buildings, some may face deterioration and they may be reevaluated. Okay, so in this example, there were remnants of a Mississippian mound. Originally nominated in 1978 at 23 acres, and the boundary change expanded the boundaries by 137 acres, actually. So the yellow striated section was the original boundary. And then the red is the proposed new boundary. It also expanded the period of significance backwards and forwards, adding several hundred years at the beginning and the end. And I think part of this is a more nuanced periodicity of the significance of these kinds of sites in terms of thinking about the important developments that led to the construction of the mounds, and then also considering that post mound occupation that really is presented by the data potential at the site. So multi-stranded evidence was used to justify the integrity of areas written off in 1978. So you can see that actually the boundary extends underneath the highway, and it used evidence about post-depositional filling to argue that actually archaeological evidence remains underneath that raised highway. Whereas in 1978, it was just written off as absolutely impossible that any archaeological remains could have been present. Here's some of the phrases used in the nomination. Geophysical survey clearly shows an intact platform mound with internal features such as an apparent entry ramp on the east end and large structures or platforms with large post pits on either side of the ramp. Geophysical survey of the mound illustrates the information value still contained within a deteriorated resource. Geoprobe cores and geophysical survey demonstrate the presence of intact soils. And then also making the argument that no other modern construction work has impacted the site. So really being nuanced about the post-depositional history of the property as well helps us to establish what's present. And then finally, there's a kind of final statement about integrity. While portions of the site have been impacted, intact soils were found in all 4 expanded areas, demonstrating that these areas were not wholly destroyed. Okay. Okay, so here's an example of placeholder language for future archaeological potential. It may be used in a nomination in the case of insufficient documentation or in cases where archaeology is outside of the scope of a district's context of significance. So there may be a statement. At present, there is insufficient data regarding the character and integrity of archaeological deposits and features within the district to support an argument for its significance under criterion D. But numerous surveys and excavations reveal the presence of deposits and features that may help define the district's spatial arrangement activity areas and inform the reconstruction of no longer extant architecture. And then the place saver language, additional survey, including the discovery of additional features or intact deposits, may merit updating the existing documentation. Okay. One of my responsibilities at the National Register is as the delegated authority of the keeper to authorize Section 304, which is the law in the National Historic Preservation Act that's invoked to restrict information. In this case, we should be considering this as we submit a National Register nomination as to whether the maps or descriptive sections contain locational information that may put the sites in risk of harm. We might ask questions like, does the narrative contain descriptive information that may serve as an enticement to loot? So the authority to withhold information is sort of understood in terms of a regional context of threat Are these sites generally looted? Is there a regional interest in a particular site type or artifact type? May knowledge of a site's location or character raise interest or visitation that interferes with traditional practitioners' ability to access the resources or larger landscape. So it also, Section 304 also protects traditional groups' ability to conduct religious ceremonies on a site. And in those cases, the best practice is to engage in redaction review with traditional peoples that may understand what is confidential or should be kept confidential. There are cases in which it's not to the advantage of preservation to withhold. So there are cases where sites may be publicly known. This may be often the case with shipwrecks that are well known to recreational divers. And actually releasing the information increases stewardship of a resource. So that should be a consideration when we're thinking about redacting. And of course, National Register nominations should be public documents as much as possible. But of course, we want to protect our archaeological information. This can be really complicated with traditional groups as well. Maureen asked a question. This is about ADs and BCs, I assume. Does that need to be an entirely new nomination, or is there an updated nomination form or documents that are used to update a listing? Additional documentation can often be added through additional sheets, these sort of continuation sheets. But when we change the boundary, it's officially a new nomination. And the legal reasoning for that is that when we're increasing the size of a nomination, that means we need also to go through the process of notifying ownership. So a boundary change is technically an entirely new nomination, but there's a lot of practical measures we might be we can take into consideration when writing that new nomination. It may reference or encompass the previous nomination, or it may replace sections of that nomination. So and of course, adding that administrative history to the nomination really helps. It can be kind of complicated also in terms of the count of resources. We may be adding resources, we may be subtracting resources, and it can get pretty complicated in terms of that contributing resource count. We're subtracting 5, but we're adding 13. So whatever we can do to add that description of the math that we're doing. So there are a few other laws that deal with confidentiality and protecting archaeological information. ARPA, of course, protects, it's the Archaeological Resource Protection Act of 1979, specifically concerns federal land, but also tribal lands. And it's both broader and more limited than Section 304. It does not depend upon eligibility. So ARPA defines an archaeological resource as a resource of archaeological interest merely. So it does not require the eligibility of a resource to be established for it to be protected. And it also operates from the vantage point of requiring information to be withheld unless releasing that information furthers its preservation. So oftentimes for federal nominations, we use both laws and it helps us to cover more. Section 304 is limited to protecting eligible information. And here's the law itself. The head of a federal agency or other public official receiving grant assistance pursuant to this division, so that includes SHPO offices, after consultation with the secretary, shall withhold from disclosure to the public information about the location, character, or ownership of a historic property. If the secretary and the agency determine that a disclosure may cause a significant invasion of privacy, risk harm to the historic property, or impede the use of a traditional religious site by practitioners. And then once a site has been protected under Section 304, through consultation specifically, there may be required an additional consultation to determine release of that information. So once we protect it behind the kind of firewall of Section 304, we should consult with the keeper to determine whether it's okay to release it in a public way, in a very public way. Of course, this doesn't cover sharing information within an agency or cross agencies. One really important consideration for why we may be thinking about the legal authorities to protect is, of course, the threat by FOIA. We really want to protect our archaeological information. And there's always this sort of give and take with the public who, of course, wants to know for one or another reason. Consultation with the keeper is often the way to go when we want to protect archaeological information from a FOIA. And of course, FOIA, the spirit of FOIA is a presumption of disclosure. It's a sunshine law. It's about trying to provide as much information as possible to the public. So being very strategic about redaction, releasing as much information as possible without putting a site at risk. And then, of course, there are other state laws. As a federal law, 304 preempts state laws, but we respect the responsibilities and mandates of states to protect their managed resources. And that often extends to things like protecting basic information about state databases. It may include redacting state trinomials or state site numbers. Okay. Getting towards the end of my presentation, actually, and we can open for questions and discussion. I wanted to provide this kind of interesting example because I think it really helps us to think about the application of criterion D when we think about historic properties other than archaeological sites eligible under D. There are a number of houses and structures that have been listed as eligible under D. They're each very particular cases, I think, and they may be eligible under other criterion, usually criterion C, because this really deals with physical aspects of a property. But this is a kind of interesting one. The Monique adobe is a unique example of adobe construction that blends two well-known construction foundation techniques. Rock foundations and concrete used in residential development between 1900 and 1914. So a criterion C, which is a sort of architectural example, criterion C is a sort of typical architectural example criterion, like a Georgian style architecture. A house may be a perfect example of a style that is noted in scholarship and contexts as exemplifying those classification systems. But in this case, we have a property that doesn't quite fit into a particular classification scheme, but it's in its sort of liminal quality between techniques that the information potential really comes out. So while there may not be that much to learn about the study of an example of an architectural style other than sort of documenting it, as is visible from the eye, taking apart one of these houses, dendrochronology or really looking at the sort of bones of a house, and then other things like builders' trenches and archaeological resources may help us to really understand a classification system in transition. And this adobe exemplifies a unique blending of both non-mortared fieldstone and unreinforced concrete to form an integral foundation for adobe residential construction. And then here's a little bit about how it was justified in here through a research design. Which is really nice. Actually, it's a format that I don't often see in nominations, and that would be, I think, really applicable to archaeological nominations to provide sort of a speculative research design for how we might attain this information, how we know the data potential is there, how we know the data sets could be applied for research questions. Does the construction of the Adobe and other site features, such as the irrigation system, significantly contribute to the development of 20th century ranches, ranch houses, Adobe ranch houses, and other technological advancements in the San Diego County? And here we have this breakdown of questions, data requirements, and then expectations. Okay, and that's the end of my formal presentation, and perhaps we can open up for discussion. My email address is there at the bottom, michael_roller@nps.gov. Glad to speak to you about your questions and your test cases.
Thank you.